Hello lovely student, welcome to my lessons on two-dimensional arrays, and today we're going to be looking at the concept, what is a two-dimensional array, how to declare an array, and the structure of a two-dimensional array. Let's have a look at it. So a two-dimensional array is a data structure, a finite data structure. It has an ordered set of elements, and the elements of a two-dimensional array is all of the same data type. How do I declare a two-dimensional array? The name of the array is called ARR_num. It is an array that is storing rows and columns. So the first dimension stipulates the rows. How many rows? This is your row lower bound, and this is your row upper bound. So I am saying that I want to start with row 1 and I want to end with row 3. So there are 3 rows. The second part is your columns. I'm stipulating again, I want to start at column 1, that is my lower bound, and I want to end at column 3. So I have 3 columns. So this array ARR_num has 3 rows and 3 columns. And it is always the rows followed by the columns. The size of the array is fixed. So you can store the data using single variables, that's the advantages. And 2, you can scroll through the elements using a nested loop. And remember that the size of the array is fixed. All the elements of the array must have the same data type, and in this array all the data type is of data type integer. How do I visualize a two-dimensional array? So let's look at the array that we declared. We declared ARR_num, which has 3 rows and 3 columns. The first one is the number of rows, starting at 1 and ending at 3. An array starts at index 1. And then it has 3 columns, starting at 1, ending at 3. And the data type of this array stores integer values. So we say this is a 3 by 3 two-dimensional array. So let's look at how do we index a two-dimensional array. So I've got a grid that looks very much like an Excel grid, and this particular array is called ARR_num, and ARR_num has 3 rows starting at index 1, and this is row 1. Rows go horizontally, so that's row 1, row 2, and row 3. So there are 3 rows starting at 1, ending at 3. Start at row 1, end at row 3. So the first part is always my rows, and it always starts at 1. The columns start at 1, and columns go vertically, very much like an Excel spreadsheet. Column 2 and column 3. So going horizontally are my rows, and going vertically are my columns. How do I index each cell of the array? So the first cell is always going to be starting with the row followed by the column. So this cell is in row 1, column 1. So that's going to be 1, 1. row 1, column 1. This is going to be row 1, column 2. And this is going to be row 1, column 3. I then go to the next row. Row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2, row 2, column 3. I then go to the next row. Row 3, column 1, row 3, column 2, and row 3, column 3. So it's always your row followed by your column. I have an example where I can populate this two-dimensional array using an assignment statement and assigning values to each cell of the array. So I'm going to be assigning in the array at row 1, column 1, I'm assigning the value 15. In row 1, column 1, I'm assigning the value 15. In row 1, column 2, I'm assigning the value 18. In row 1, column 3, I'm assigning the value 24. In row 2, column 1, I'm assigning the value 10. In row 2, column 2, I'm assigning the value 9. In row 2, column 3, I'm assigning the value 6. In row 3, column 1, I'm assigning the value 19. In row 3, column 2, I'm assigning the value 25. And in row 3, column 3, I'm assigning the value 12. So the array is now populated with values, and the first way of populating an array with values is where I can physically assign values to each cell of the array. And remember, each cell has a cell index starting with the row followed by the column. How do I populate a two-dimensional array? Using a nested for loop. And I'm going to get a value from an input box. Using loops are very advantageous. It's very valuable. You can store the data using a single variable, and you can scroll through the elements using a nested for loop. So let's see how the nested for loop works. So I wrote a segment of a program to populate the array. We'll be getting a value from the keyboard using a dialog box, an input box. So when R starts off at 1, my outer for loop, R and C are my loop counters. They are just loop counter variables. You can call it I and J. You can call it K and L. It's up to you what you want to name your counting variables. Remember, this is a loop counting variable, and it is always declared of data type integer. So my outer for loop starts at 1 and ends at 3. I come in, my inner for loop starts at 1 and ends at 3. And each time I'm entering a value. So let's see how the for loop works. So when R starts off at 1, I test my condition, is 1 less than or equal to 3 true. I then come into my inner for loop. My inner for loop, my counting variable is C. C starts off at 1. I test my condition. If it evaluates to true, yes, 1 is less than or equal to 3. I then get a value into R, C, 1, 1. At index 1, 1, ARR num of 1, 1, I'm inputting a value and the value is 15. I hit this end and I go back up, and my C loop is incremented and C now goes to 2. I am now getting a value into ARR num of 1, 2. The first row, second cell. First row, second cell. I'm inputting a value via the input box and the value is 18. I increment my C loop. I then go up and C is now 3. I'm getting a value in 1, 3. The first row, third cell, I'm getting a value from an input box. The value is 24. My inner for loop is now completed. I now increment my counter for my outer for loop. My outer for loop now goes to 2. I test my condition. Is 2 less than or equal to 3? True. I come into my C loop. C now starts at 1. I'm now getting a value and I'm putting that value from the dialog box. I'm entering that value into the array when R is 2 and C is 1. 2, 1. ARR num of 2, 1 is now getting a value of 10. At the end, what happens to my C? My C loop increments to 2. I test my condition, true. I now enter another value into 2, 2. I enter the value 9. My C loop now goes to 3. I enter another value and I'm getting a value from an input box which is 6. My inner for loop is now complete. And now at the end, and my R outer for loop is now incremented. R now takes on the value 3. I come in and my C starts again at 1. So in ARR num of 3, 1, I'm getting a value which is 19. At the end, my C loop is incremented to 2. I'm now getting a value in 3, 2. I'm getting a value from a dialog box which is 25. I hit the end and C now goes to 3. I now get another value and it is 12. My inner for loop is now complete. I hit the end and I go back up and R now goes to 4 and your nested for loop terminates. So remember, in the nested for loop you have an outer for loop and an inner for loop. When the outer for loop starts at 1, the inner for loop must execute that many times until the inner for loop is complete. And once the inner for loop is complete, it goes back to the outer for loop. It then starts again and populates the inner for loop. It uses the inner for loop to populate each value of the array. It hits the end and it goes back up and the outer for loop starts again, and then the inner for loop starts at 1 again. So each time that the outer for loop is incremented by 1, the inner for loop is running 3 times. Let's go on to the next step. How do I extract data from a 2D array? So how do I access the data? I've learned how to populate a 2D array. Let's look at how we're going to access the data or extract the data or even display the data in neatly aligned columns, like the way it'll appear on an Excel spreadsheet. So if I want to display in tabular form, in a table form, let's look at the segment of a program. So again, I'm going to use to enter data into, to populate the 2D array, I'm going to use a nested for loop. To display data, to extract and access data from a 2D array, I've got to make use of a nested for loop. So I got 2 loop counters, R and C, both of data type integer. I've created an object string to concatenate each value of each row of the array. So we're going to see how the object string works and performs concatenation. Because it is a string variable, I've initialized it to the null string. My R loop is starting from 1 and ending at 3. My inner loop is starting at 1, ending at 3. It's a 3 by 3 dimensional array. And all I'm saying is the object string objstr, which is null at the moment, must take on the first value of the array when R is 1 and C is 1 and display it with a tab setting. So it's going to display the first value of the array, which was 15. Remember, I hit the end and I go back up. C is now 2. It's going to display in row 1, column 2. I'm going to extract the next value of the array at row 1, column 2, and then it's going to display 18. I'm going to tab it so that it leaves a little bit of space between each one, and then I hit the end and C goes to 3. In row 1, column 3, I'm going to display the next value. So I have successfully displayed the first row. Remember, your outer for loop gives you access to a row. The outer for loop is going to take you to the first row. The inner for loop is going to take you through the columns 1, 2, 3. So when the outer for loop gives you first row, the inner for loop is giving you the first, second, and third column. Now I need to go to the next row. But before I go to the next row, I need to display the first row. So before I go up, when R becomes 2, I need to display the first row. So that's what I've done, displaying the entire row. My object string, when you say read output.lines.add, it takes it automatically to a new line. And now I need to initialize my object string, the string variable that I'm going to use to concatenate. Set it back to a null string. I now go back up and R is incremented to 2. C now starts off at 1. 2, 1. I want to display the value in 2, 1. ARR num of 2, 1. Display the value and it displays 10. Tab sets. At the end, C now becomes 2. In 2, 2, in ARR num of 2, 2, I want to display that value. I hit the end and C now becomes 3. In ARR num of 2, 3, I now want to display the next value and tab set. And then all it's doing is that it's creating this object string and it's displaying 10, 9, and 6 very neatly in tabs. I now initialize my object string to a null string, nothing. I go back up and R now becomes 3. C starts off at 1. I'm now displaying at 3, 1, it displays 19. C now goes to 2. At 3, 2, it displays 25. And C now goes to 3, and then it displays 12. It creates that object string and it displays the values in the third row. 3, 1, 3, 2, and 3, 3. ARR num of 3, 1, ARR num of 3, 2, and ARR num of 3, 3. It's all added to form an object string. And at the end, all I'm doing is displaying that line of code. The variable now initializes to null. I go back up and R is now 4 and the loop terminates. So I managed to display very neatly aligned in tab columns. Okay, so let's look at the Delphi program for populating and extracting data from a two-dimensional array. So I have the first button is capture data, where I'm just getting a user input from the keyboard. Let's have a look at it. So all I'm doing here is I've got two variables R and C of data type integer. My outer for loop is running from 1 to 3. My inner for loop is running from 1 to 3. And all I'm doing is each time when R is 1 and C is 1, I'm getting a value from an input box. Remember, I hit the end and I go back up into my C loop. C now becomes 2. An ARR num of 1, 2. I'm getting another value from an input box. I got to do this until the inner for loop is complete, and then I go back up and my R loop increments. Let's look at the next button where I populate the data, but here I'm randomly generating values and storing it into a 2-dimensional array. Let's have a look at that coding. So the difference is, there's your R and C, data type integer, outer for loop from 1 to 3. My inner for loop is starting at 1 and ending at 3. I'm getting a value in each cell of the array by randomly generating a value from 1 to 50. Random range is a predefined function of the math unit. I'm starting at 1 and I want to end at 50, but the second parameter is always end index plus 1. Now note, I made 2 very valuable points for you. When I make reference to ARR num of R, C, this refers to the element or the value stored in the array at that cell index. But if I had to make reference to just R, C, that is the reference to the actual cell index. Remember, ARR num of R, C gives me the value stored in the array at that cell index. R, C gives me the index. Okay, so let's have a look at the display. To extract data, we discussed this, but let's quickly step through the code. I created an object string and I initialized it to the null string. My outer for loop is starting at 1, ending at 3. It's a 3 by 3 dimensional, 2-dimensional array. My inner for loop is starting at 1, ending at 3. I'm creating an object string each time I'm stepping through the columns. When the first row, when R is 1, the outer for loop gives me access to rows. Okay, outer for loop, access to rows. I come in and the inner for loop has to execute 3 times. The inner for loop access to each column. So the inner for loop is giving me access to the first, second, and third column, and I'm formulating an object string, a string value, to display the first row values. At the end of the inner for loop, after I have accessed each value from row 1, I then display the first row, and then my object string is now initialized back to the null string. I go back up and R is now 2. And then I'm going into the next row, which is row 2, and then my columns start again. Row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2, row 2, column 3. And I create an object string each time. And this is string concatenation. So all it's doing is it's joining each value of the row. Right, so let's have a look and see how this program works. Okay, so if I had to capture values, and I want to capture the data that I use, okay, just put any data. So that's 15. Okay, so that is only going to enter data. It's going to populate the array with 9 integer values. Let's extract it, and there's it neatly displayed in tabular columns, and it looks like a neat spreadsheet. Okay, so the next one I want to run is the generate button, but this time I'm not entering data from the keyboard. I'm going to randomly generate values. Okay, so it's randomly generating any 9 values, and it's storing it into the array called ARRNum. When I extract it, it just populated the array with random values. And it's very neatly aligned in columns. Thank you, learners, for listening. Stay inspired, stay motivated, and follow me on my next video.